Hi everyone. Hi. My name is Anni Pokela. I am project manager for Operaatio Arctis. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to Arctic Momentum. Thank you. I will be your host this evening, so you're going to probably see me a lot on this stage, but don't worry. I'm going to give plenty of space to all the wonderful experts and activists that have joined us here from all over the world. We're so grateful to see you all here. We have organized this event together with Silver Lining and Rare Media. And a special thanks to Kelly Wanser and everyone else at Silver Lining. We wouldn't be here without you guys. Thank you. Now, before we get any further, just a couple of notes about practical issues. By attending this event, you have agreed to comply with our Safer Space guidelines. And if you see anyone not respecting these guidelines, please contact our safety team. You can recognize them by their wonderful Barbie pink tags on their shirts. They will be happy to help you. Okay, here's a brief look at the program this evening. We're going to have a lot of interesting speeches and discussions here on the stage tonight. Please note that you'll be pretty free to roam around this auditorium or between this auditorium and the hall back there. Not during speeches, but in between panels, or if you need to leave at any point, you can do so. And please put your phones on silent mode if you haven't done that already. Thanks. You can also check the program on our website, seen here on the screen, or by scanning this QR code right there. But right now, I want to tell you a bit more about why exactly we're here. Let me start like this. I want you to imagine you're a smoker. And you've smoked for a long time, okay? You've smoked for 30 years. And back in the day when you started smoking, a friend told you that you should quit. And well, you told them, okay, one day, eventually I'll quit. And now 30 years have passed. You've just walked out of your doctor's. Turns out you have lung cancer. And so you finally quit smoking. Wise choice, right? But the problem is you've already got cancer. You know, it doesn't help to just quit smoking once you've already got cancer. You need an intervention. You need to intervene in the process of cancer spreading around because it has already started to do so. It's quite a heavy story, right? I mean, lung cancer is obviously a terrible thing, but it speaks to the situation where we are today. 30 years ago, they told us, or well, not me, but most people, that we need to eventually stop emitting carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere, or else, you know. And well, we didn't. Now the else is happening. So we should start looking at some interventions. So let's look at what's happening in the Arctic. High up there in the north, we have this vast area of water called the Arctic Ocean. And the Arctic Ocean is covered with sea ice, which is this sun-blocking shield. Now, the Arctic is as it is because of this sea ice, because part of the Arctic remains frozen from winter to summer to winter year-round. And the sea ice reflects sunlight and keeps the area cold. And it also provides a living environment and hunting ground for many. And it also keeps the area less politically tensioned. Now, a big part of us humans have, in the past some decades, put so many gases up into the atmosphere that the year-round sea ice will be lost. That means that the area will have no ice at the end of summer, and that all of the old year-round sea ice will be lost. Some say this will happen quite soon, some will say sooner. And the important thing is this will happen even if we cut emissions rapidly. So even if we would cut emissions the fastest way, which we definitely should be doing, we would still see the so-called blue ocean event. The Arctic Sea with no ice. So what does this mean? It means two things. It means that we are facing an Arctic climate catastrophe. And it means that simply cutting emissions won't save us from this. Which means that we should be looking for and developing additional ways to stop this, which we are not doing right now on the scale and pace that would give us a good chance of preventing this from happening. And that's down to us. The civil society, government actors, and the private sector, they're not taking action. They're not even giving an opinion about saving the Arctic sea ice, because we don't have the courage to touch the trickiest issues. So what happens when we lose the summer sea ice? The Arctic heats up more and faster. Less sea ice, more carbon-absorbing dark seawater, more heat. Less snow around the Arctic, more heat. As the sea ice evaporates, the local greenhouse effect becomes even stronger. More heat, and so on. They call it Arctic amplification. The Arctic heating has global effects. Permafrost, and I mean the permanently frozen land, will melt. As the ground collapses, people's houses are washed into the ocean. Same with roads, infrastructure. And as the sea ice weakens, the food-providing North Water Peninsula between Greenland and Canada is under threat. The indigenous peoples are, as ever so often, on the front lines of these impacts. And that's why the Arctic indigenous peoples should have the biggest say in what we will try to do about Arctic amplification. Arctic heating changes the Arctic. It raises sea levels and threatens coastal cities. It also creates more extreme weather, which allows more heat up to the Arctic. So you have this vicious cycle. And it doesn't end there. No matter what we do with our emissions, we are also already past the 1.5 degrees threshold. And then there's the bad news. 1.5 degrees happens to be the tipping point for 4 major Earth system elements: the Greenland ice sheet, the West Antarctic ice sheet, the tropical coral reefs, and the abrupt thaw of the boreal permafrost. Beyond 1.5 degrees, it becomes likely that all of these systems will start collapsing. So 1.5 is gone, safety for the major ice sheets is gone, and the Arctic summer sea ice will be gone, even if we cut emissions rapidly. So, what's the plan? Let me stress this. A lot of damage is already unavoidable with only emission cuts. And while we must cut emissions rapidly, we must do so, we must also ask ourselves, is it enough? In our society, we have this old climate paradigm. And this old paradigm says, it is enough. The old paradigm says, let's cut emissions and hope for the best. In this old paradigm, we don't really take any responsibility for preventing any specific changes or collapses. The old paradigm doesn't state which ecosystems are essential and to whom. It doesn't state which things we cannot afford to lose, which things we hold dear, which things we love the most. And this old paradigm dominates our society. From us, the climate movement, to government, to business, and to be frank, large parts of academia as well. So bring down emissions, hope for the best, adapt to the rest, if possible. A huge level of damage, death, and sorrow already accepted. You know, the white flag's already flying. The old paradigm was born 30 years ago. Now imagine we would now create a new paradigm from scratch today. Imagine if we as humanity had just found out that temperatures are rising and that it's caused by emissions. We would learn that the Arctic climate system is collapsing. We would learn that the tropical coral reefs are toast. We would learn that we are going way past any temperature limit that could be described as safe. What strategies would we be discussing? Would we on the highest levels and in the public be discussing things like, how could we still save the Arctic sea ice? Is there any way to halt sea level rise? Is there any way that we could still restore those coral reefs? We would, but we aren't. Because we're stuck in the past. We're struggling to hold on to that old story, the story in which the immense level of suffering is unavoidable. Stuck with what we in Operaatio Arktis's recent publication, Arctic Endgame, call politics of accepted victims. The old paradigm was born 30 years ago. This brings us back to the story about lung cancer. Once the collapse is already started, you might just consider medication, even a risky intervention, because the other option is assured disaster. The old paradigm was born 30 years ago, and it doesn't accept climate intervention. The reality has since changed. The new paradigm is rooted in the realization that emission mitigation didn't go as it should have gone. There's already too much carbon in the atmosphere, already too much heat in the oceans. Now, the new paradigm is about climate repair. Climate repair means repairing the climate. It means reversing and minimizing the damage that's already underway, regardless of emission cuts. It's about not giving up, not accepting the damage. It's about intervening in the process of deterioration and collapse. Climate repair is about zeroing emissions, but it's also about removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere and repairing and providing active support for the parts of Earth that are already breaking apart. And there are potential techniques for this, climate interventions. Techniques that make the Earth more reflective, techniques that increase the carbon uptake of the biomass, techniques that support the glaciers. Brightening marine clouds with sea salt, adding aerosols into the upper atmosphere, increasing nutrients in the high seas, installing structures to prevent warmer water from intruding the underside of ice sheet glaciers. But let me be clear, they involve risks too. And we need to take those risks very seriously. Just as the risks that we are dealing with on this current trajectory. It's yet to be proven whether these techniques or some of them work for the better rather than for the worse. But there is a chance for climate repair, and it's quite a promising one. Now, people often reject the idea of climate repair on the grounds that it may lower motivation for emission cuts. And yes, there is a risk. And we should be figuring out ways to, for example, tie together climate repair with specifically emission targets. And also, the risk is not certain. Climate repair could also help us bring down emissions faster. Climate repair could help us prevent climate-connected crises. And those crises always take the attention of governments and societies from longer-term goals like cutting emissions to day-to-day survival. Climate repair could help us support the glaciers and halt sea level rise so that governments can concentrate on building carbon-free infrastructure instead of flood walls and pumping systems or even relocating entire cities or nations. Climate repair could also help us protect our forests from the terrible wildfires that are caused by overheating. So you really cannot know which will happen. And our job is to imagine, to be open to new possible routes, because a lot of it is in our hands. Comparing the risks requires a clear picture of the risks and, of course, the benefits. And for that, we need a lot more research. Now, the thing is, we have limited time to make decisions on whether to pursue climate repair or not. So we have to discuss it right now. That's because the climate system is non-linear, meaning that beyond certain points, the changes accelerate. They become self-sustaining. Think about a ball. I put a ball up here. You're kicking a ball on top of a hill. Now you kick the ball, and it rolls, and it stops. And now you kick the ball again, and the ball reaches the point where the hilltop turns into a slope. So now you've kicked the ball hard enough, so it's going to go down whether you kick it again or not. So either you catch the ball, or it's down the hill. You can't unroll the ball anymore. You need to run for the ball. And that's the situation with these Earth system elements right now. They're reaching the slope, and they're going to go down unless we stop them. They're crossing their tipping points, no matter if the global temperatures stabilize. So we know staying under 1.5 is not possible without climate intervention. We know the Arctic sea ice will be lost without climate intervention. And we know that the Greenland ice sheet and the West Antarctic ice sheet will cross their tipping points beyond 1.5 degrees. That is, without climate repair. So what do? What's the plan? Will we try to catch the ball or not? If we are to catch the ball, we need common research questions and goals. We need teams trying together to figure out how to stop these collapses from happening. We need a lot of political will and willpower and financing. We need all of the sectors of our society taking part in this, just like in emission mitigation. All hands on deck. And we need open and equitable decision-making and governance. Everybody needs to be aware of this, and everybody needs to have a chance to take part in this discussion, to have a say on what trajectory we want to put ourselves on. We must not give up. We must not descend into defeat. There's still a chance for climate repair. And as a 22-year-old who has become very familiar with the bleak future we're looking at on this trajectory, but also as someone who truly sees the chance that is this new paradigm, I just want to tell you, this is not the time for giving up. This is not the time. We must examine and investigate the ways for climate repair. We must adapt the new paradigm, even if it leads us to rejecting climate repair, rejecting climate intervention techniques. Because that's the thing, even to that conclusion, we must arrive through the new paradigm, not by just accepting the damage that's already unavoidable without climate repair. We owe it to ourselves, and we owe it to the young people, and we owe it to the communities on the climate front lines to ask ourselves, are we truly ready to accept the damage that's unavoidable without climate repair? Or will we give climate repair a chance? Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Now, next up, it is my pleasure to welcome virtually on the stage Professor Nana Amma Brown-Klutz. She unfortunately couldn't be here today with us in person, but we're going to hear a greeting from her, and we're going to look at the question, is it time for a paradigm shift? Thank you.
So I said that it's important to do a lot more research in this field because it's still new. People do not understand it yet. Even within the scientific community, even within the climate community, it's new. So more research is important for people to understand. And if you're able to do policy briefs for government and policy makers to also get to know what it is, the new area of thinking, it will help. Exactly. The civil society have, I would say, a very big role to play in this because their voices go really far. First, they must understand what it is, what the situation is, and then they should understand their position on this, their role to play in the society. So I believe once they understand what this intervention is all about, they will, with that, they will be encouraged to advocate in that direction for mitigation of the climate change. All they need is the understanding of what we are trying to do. So we need to get them involved as much as possible on every step on the way, so they will be able to take it up and advocate for it as much as possible. Yes, so even in the SIT assessment report, we had introduced the geoengineering. And so in the 7th assessment report, as this topic is becoming more advanced and clearer to people, we believe we'll get some publications, a lot more publications in the area. You know, the IPCC doesn't conduct research from scratch on its own. It takes the information out there and reports same to government. So it depends on what the community put out there. The IPCC will pick it up and also project it same to the various governments. So we should encourage ourselves to do more research in this area, and then it will be a loud voice in the IPCC as well. Thank you.
So that was again Professor Nana Ama-Brown-Klutz. She is the vice president of the first working group of the IPCC, and she's also right now researching solar climate intervention in Ghana. So happy that we could get her at least in video format. So next up, it's my great pleasure to welcome to the stage to give a short speech about Finland's role in preventing Arctic climate risks from a foreign policy perspective. Please welcome to the stage, Pekka Haavisto.
So good to see all of you here, and good to be here to witness that so many people are now following the Arctic issues and doing something for the Arctic issues. And when I drafted my couple of words, I remembered many years ago my responsibilities as the Minister of Environment, 95 to 99. And there were actually two important meetings that time. First was the establishment of Arctic Council. I was the Finnish representative in Ottawa when Arctic Council was founded. And there were two tasks for this council. One was the protection of the indigenous people and their culture, and the other was combating the climate change and environmental change in the Arctic areas. And now, after all these years, we can evaluate that the things have not been moving so rapidly to the right direction. And I still remember the spring 2019 meeting in Rovaniemi, the Arctic Council meeting, where unfortunately at that time US administration didn't even recognize the importance of the climate change and that something should and could be done for that. That was missing, if I remember correctly, from the resolution of that meeting. The other meeting that I remember very well is 1997 Kyoto meeting. It was the first, I would say, global climate meeting, and of course, then the EU was a very important player around the table in those negotiations. I have to say that I quite many times had to call back home to our, that time, Minister for Trade and Industry and so forth, to convince our Finnish colleagues that something should be done and Finland should be part of it and not abstaining or preventing the decision making that time. It was very tough discussions also nationally. But the interesting part came actually when the final Kyoto Protocol was adopted. The Japanese Minister of Environment burst to tears. And I was thinking that he's crying for happiness because successful conference has been taking place in Kyoto, in Japan. But he was crying because this -6 that Japan committed to with the CO2 emission will ruin the economy of Japan. And I really remember all those very emotional feelings that were there around decision makers, but luckily all others didn't burst to tears in that meeting. But that maybe reflects quite well how difficult it was to make the first relevant decisions on climate and also protecting the Arctic. Then when looking at the Finnish Arctic strategy and Arctic planning, our strategy was updated in 2021, and it has 4 priorities. I think you are quite familiar with these. First, of course, the climate change mitigation and adaptation, and recognizing the Arctic areas are warming up more rapidly than other areas, and this will be a disaster, of course, for the whole globe. The other principle was about the inhabitants' welfare issues, Sami and indigenous peoples' protection, and I think this is still one of our key responsibilities. Also protecting the culture, the languages, the traditions in the Arctic area. The third was actually is the Arctic experience, the research, the science, everything that we know about the nature, climate, environment, how our businesses could adapt to these facts and how we could do more at the research side. And I think this is something that is very close to our heart, of course, also including the education. And then infrastructure and logistics, how the population there could be served, but also how in a sustainable way some of the Arctic areas could be used, for example, for telecommunication links and cables and so forth. All this was included in our Arctic strategy. But of course, now we are facing a political situation where problem is also the combination of the 8 countries in the Arctic Council, when one of the countries is Russia. And when the Russian attack against Ukraine started, it meant also downplaying many of those activities of the Arctic Council on the political level that existed or we were planning. My last meeting as a foreign minister with the Arctic Council ministers was spring 2021 in Reykjavik. 8 Arctic foreign ministers sitting around the same table. And I very much remember when that time and still Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said that finally the scientists in Russia start to believe that climate change is true, that we politicians have been pushing now for years. And I asked, what does this mean, and how have you been so convinced that this climate change exists? He said, well, we are suffering when the permafrost is melting and the pipelines are collapsing, gas and oil pipelines, so it has a major economic effect in our Arctic areas. So this is witnessing that climate change is true. And somehow I felt that, well, this is maybe beginning for some people to understand that something is really happening in this globe. We also discussed about the other issue, which has been always very close to my heart, because the Russian environmental movements, Russian Greenpeace and others has always been advocating that, and it's picking the nuclear waste around the Novaya Zemlya. That time, Foreign Minister Lavrov mentioned that, well, it was also a mistake to dump the nuclear waste into Arctic areas, and we should have an international project to pick up that nuclear waste around Novaya Zemlya. I couldn't do more than agree with his good idea. But I think again, even that project and that plan certainly is freezed in many ways. One issue that when we are dealing with the Arctic, and I will actually just leave with that thought, is about the democracy and democratic decision making and the democratic evaluation of different plans. We can see that many countries have their own plans. There are military plans, there are environmental plans, there are economic plans, there are digging plans for new minerals, or taking them from the bottom of the sea and so forth, and so many different kinds of planning are covering the Arctic area. And I have a feeling that countries and companies do not share all that information. And one day when Arctic Council really should be again alive, that would be, of course, one task to coordinate all these different efforts. But before that, we have to be very cautious about the different type of planning that is taking place in the Arctic areas. And particularly, I'm concerned during these days, all military plans that could exist and take place in the region. When we have more tensions in the world, more tensions in Europe, there will be more tensions also in the Arctic areas, and we should do our utmost to keep Arctic areas out of those tensions. One final remark, which was a lesson to me when talking about the two poles, and Finland, of course, has also the scientific interest on the southern pole. As you know, we had a big conference last spring here in Helsinki on that issue. But when discussing about these topics, particularly with the Indians, they always speak about the three poles. They say that Himalaya should also be taken into account, that the very similar melting of the glacier, similar climate effects are taking place in their country, and they should be also partner on all those discussions. And I somehow agree, maybe not on the geographic issue that there are three poles, but there are countries that are suffering the same phenomenon with the glaciers. I'm thinking about the Switzerland, I'm thinking about even Kenya, Kilimanjaro area, and so forth. When you look to Akseli Gallen-Kallela painting more than 100 years ago, I guess, or around 100 years ago, you see the glacier and the snow that is covering Kilimanjaro, and today you see different pictures. There are many countries that are sharing this type of interest, which could be scientific, which could be political, and we could really build wider political front to protect the glaciers and the ice cover of the planet. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pekka, for that. Next up, we are going forward to a panel. And we are going to welcome to the stage to discuss with the two of them from Operaatio Arktis, Anton Keskinen, and from Arctic Center, University of Lapland, Professor John Moore. Welcome. Take it away.
Thank you, Anni, and thank you, Pekka, very much for having us here. Maybe I should start introducing you, or maybe myself first. I'm Anton. I'm from Operaatio Arktis, and that's that. But you are John Moore, a British scientist, chief scientist and research professor working at the University of Lapland. You knew that already, right? So, okay. John is a member of the Finnish Academy of Science and Letters, as well as 6 Antarctic, 4 Greenlandic, and 20 Svalbard scientific expeditions. John led the Chinese geoengineering research program from 2015 to 2022. And at the moment, you are mainly researching methods to actively conserve the cryosphere, especially the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets, right?
Yes, that's right. I've done a lot of research on things, the traditional style of geoengineering, but that's kind of a little bit difficult from the governance angle. You have to get so many countries to agree on things. One of the advantages of working with the ice sheets is that they are much more regionally confined, so you can do things with a smaller group of countries.
Yeah, that's right, that's right. We have this quite big question time for a paradigm shift that we should discuss now for a couple of minutes. Maybe we could start from the from your field of expertise, which is this ice sheet conservation. So when it comes to ice sheets, are these huge ice masses on land. So when they melt, they will rise to sea level. And when it comes to the West Antarctic ice sheet, you've one time described that the survival of some of the most vulnerable glaciers are actually already disconnected from what's happening in the atmosphere. Could you elaborate a bit on that?
Well, yeah, the point is that throughout the Industrial Revolution and our emissions of greenhouse gases, most of the heat has been captured by the oceans. So more than 90% of the total amount of heat. And of course, that's an enormous reservoir that is just sitting there, and it's very difficult to get rid of that. There's no kind of equilibrium, fast process that can do this sort of thing to reach a steady state. Parts of the ice sheet, the West Antarctic ice sheet, for example, it's sitting on a seabed that is below the present sea level. So if you remove the ice sheet, there would just be a few islands sticking up above the surface of the ocean.
So they are holding up the ice sheet, or?
Well, the
How
ice
does it
sheet is perhaps 3 kilometers thick, but maybe 2 kilometers of that is below the present sea level. So the enormous weight of the ice is pressing down on the bed. But what that is that the sea floor is sloping in towards the middle of the ice sheet. As the ice is retreating, more and more of it is exposed to the warm water at its edges. And that's like the ball rolling down the hill, that it's an inherently unstable situation. And once you start that ball rolling down the hill, it doesn't really matter what the temperature of the air is. You have to physically try to prop up the ice sheet. And, well...
How could it be done? Any ideas? What's the plan?
Yeah, well, you see, the big problem is that the warm water has accelerated the melting underneath the floating parts of the ice shelves, they're called, which are usually a few hundred meters thick, maybe a kilometer thick when they start to float from the edge of the ice sheet. The melting that can occur from the seawater is much more fast than from the air. So you can get melt rates of 50 meters per year because you have seawater. And of course, when you get in a bath, you know you cool down a lot faster in ice-cold water than you do in the air. And the same thing, the ice melts so much more effectively in contact with water than the air. So this is the thing, that the air can maybe melt about 1 meter per year, but the ocean is doing things 10, 20, 50 times faster. So you need to do something about that warm ocean water. Try and keep it away. And we're actually quite lucky that the ice sheets drain through things like the plug hole in a bathtub. They flow through these narrow, fast-flowing ice streams. So if you can do something about those ice streams, you don't need to worry about the vast majority of the inland ice. So you just need to keep this warm water away from the vulnerable parts where it's exiting.
Some certain points.
Yeah, there's literally a handful of these places in Greenland and another handful in Antarctica. So that's the thing that gives you such enormous leverage. You don't need to deal with this continental size problem. You can just deal with things that they're big, of course, but they're of the order of tens of kilometers across rather than tens of thousands of kilometers like the whole coastline of Antarctica or Greenland. So it's a more manageable kind of intervention.
Right, and so if we are to intervene with the collapsing of the West Antarctic ice sheet, we could try to plug these narrow ways that bring the warm water under the glaciers and the ice sheet. But what happens if we don't do this?
Well, this is the point, that once you've started the ball rolling down the hill, this is an excellent analogy for this, it will stop. We don't have this control of the thermostat anymore to prevent that. The only thing that you could try to do is maybe gracefully deal with this amount of sea level rise. But the thing is, we know the total amount of sea level, roughly. We're talking 3 or 4 meters of global sea level that is locked up in these unstable glaciers. But
that means if the ice sheet's gone, the sea levels will rise.
That's
4 meters.
the global average, 3
Yeah.
or 4 meters, yes. But we don't know, does it take 200 years? Does it take 300 years? These things are kind of slow in the human lifetime, but we are still talking in this century of something like 1 meter of sea level rise from Antarctica.
And that's bad.
Yeah, because most of the sea level rise, the sea doesn't respond like the water in a bathtub. Unfortunately, it always seems to be the case that the global south gets the worst of the deal. Though the tropical areas are where sea level is going to rise more than the global average.
Because we are losing the gravitational sort of element of the ice sheets.
Yes, yes. So you've got less ice sucking the seawater closer to it.
Yeah.
And also, you tend to find that the coastlines have a much higher sea level rise than the middle of the ocean, which is, of course, unfortunate because everybody lives on the coastline rather than the middle of the ocean.
Correct. If I remember correctly, yes. Yes. Okay, so what should I ask? So often people criticize climate interventions or even talking about this in the fears, or should I say like valid concerns that it will interfere with the process of green transition and cutting emissions and zeroing emissions essentially. And that's the very important work we have to do, is to get emissions down. And I greatly applaud to everybody who's doing that. And I know there's a lot of friends and colleagues here who are working on that. And by the way, I want to congratulate Eurocapina for receiving a huge grant for this work. So great job. I love you guys. And at the same time, what we have been talking about is that the sea level rise, if we don't halt it, it will require immense building of pumping systems and flood walls, just as Anni said, even relocating entire cities, and that will cost like $40 billion a year or something like this.
Yes, it's been budgeted that 1 meter of sea level rise will cost $40 billion per year to maintain the coastal sea level defenses around the world.
Yes, and even if you wouldn't be concerned about people having to use a lot of money, there's a lot of places where there is no money to do that.
Exactly.
The most vulnerable places, people don't have the resources to relocate rice fields, relocate their homes.
Yes, this is a terribly undemocratic and unjust way of dealing with this kind of crisis. It's much better for everybody if we can try to conserve the ice sheets. And this is the point, that if we do nothing, they will go away, or some of them will go away. So you have to actually take action. It's conservation by action, by doing, rather than saying hands off. We now have to say, we need to get everybody's hands on, actually.
Yeah. And with the Greenland ice sheet, it's more dependent on what's happening in the atmosphere, or am I correct? And thus, it's related to the losing of the sea ice. Or...
Yeah. Of course, as the Arctic Ocean warms up around it, then yes, there's more warm air that will be melting the surface of Greenland. There is still the warm water as well that is creating some of the ice sheet retreat. It's about 50-50 at the moment. In 100 years' time, the ice sheet might be considerably smaller and further away from the coast. And the problem is that as the melting occurs, this accelerates because it's less high, it's sitting in the warmer, lower atmosphere and melting more and more each year.
That's the elevation feedback.
Yes.
Yeah. So, yes, while I just want to emphasize that we have to keep on fighting for system change and cutting emissions, zeroing them as soon as possible and getting into the negative emission regime or era. But Anni was talking about this paradigm shift or need for paradigm change, coming from the idea that we should just keep on cutting emissions and hope for the best, to maybe start to think about these interventions, whether it's the ice sheet conservation project you are doing, or whether it's solar radiation management stuff that we're going to hear more.
Yeah,
I
think
what do you think about this?
It's absolutely key that we start to recognize these parts of the cryosphere as global goods This is something that benefits the whole planet. Everybody needs to keep the permafrost frozen and the ice sheets and the sea ice as stable as possible. But they're not valued, and the indigenous peoples are not given the credit for the stewardship that they can and could do even better in the future. So we need to have mechanisms globally enacted that will provide funds to allow these kind of interventions, because we're not talking about the poor people in Bangladesh or the 56,000 Greenlanders. It has to be from the polluters should pay for this, but it's a benefit for them. To protect the West Antarctic ice sheet, we estimate would cost about $50 billion, or about the cost of 1 year's damage if you let it go. So it's not only benefiting like the local inhabitants in Greenland, it's actually benefiting the rich guys in condos in Miami or wherever they are around the world.
The guys who should pay for this, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Just as you said. Yeah, I agree on that. I totally agree on that.
No, we need some radical changes in the economics so that the taxes reflect the kinds of damage that is done by burning fossil fuels, of course.
Yes, radical change in economics sounds good for me. And this is just another point where we could start to see these climate interventions as complementing to the emission reduction agenda and the whole transition.
Yes, everybody agrees that we have to get to net zero and actually suck the stuff out of the atmosphere. But having as many arrows in your quiver as possible, it is the best option to prevent catastrophe, really.
Let's leave it there. Thank you very much, John. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Anton and John. Next up, it's time for you to meet even more of our wonderful experts here today. So first of all, let me introduce to the stage Alice Wells.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having us. This is fantastic. So I'm Alice Wells. I'm a PhD student from the University of Exeter in the southwest of England, and I am researching stratospheric aerosol injection as a form of solar climate intervention. And I'm very happy today to be hosting this panel on preventing Arctic climate risks. So we'll be discussing the governance and state of knowledge of solar climate intervention and opening the discussion on the potential of marine cloud brightening and stratospheric aerosol injection in supporting the Arctic cryosphere. So first, I'd like to welcome to the stage Kelly Wanzer. Kelly is a climate innovator and advocate and executive director of Silver Lining, a non-profit organization dedicated to ensuring that society has sufficient information and options to address near-term climate risk. In that capacity, she's helped develop legislation, testified before Congress, developed global engagement efforts, and established a non-profit research program. She was recently featured on CNN, CBS News, and in widely viewed TED Talks. So please welcome Kelly.
Thank you very much, Alice. I'm very honored to be here. My organization, Silver Lining, is very privileged to support Operatio Arctis in the organization of this event and the stakeholder workshop they held beforehand. And in the context of the paradigm shift, I think that the young generation of leaders represented by Operatio Arctis is very hopeful. And this is, I've been working in this field now for over a decade, and this is already one of the best dialogues that I've experienced. So I'm really pleased and honored to be here. And I'm going to introduce to you a little bit about one potential approach to the paradigm shift with regard to the Arctic. Let me see if I can make the clicker work. And one of the contexts that we're in with respect to the Arctic and global climate change as a whole is the scale of the problem. So one of the things that we have to think about in intervention is what can we do that scales, and that scales along the time horizon that we need it to. So the Arctic is a very big in scale in learning about it. You know, we're talking about an area approximately the size of the continent of Africa. And that's where we're looking at trying to arrest this very big ball going down the hill. So we have a problem of scale and we have a problem of time. So we're seeing the changes in the Arctic that are happening on average more rapidly than or at the outside of the projections that climate scientists have. And the thing that we know that was referred to before is that the climate system is projected to continue to warm in all of the scenarios that the UN climate change body looks at. So whatever problems we see now, those are projected to get worse currently in every scenario that we've got. And that means we need something in the portfolio that might act relatively quickly at a very large scale. So in the past 10 or 15 years, scientific bodies looked at the question of, you know, what might have the highest potential to reduce warming in the climate system at a very large scale relatively quickly. And where they landed, this was in the US National Academy of Sciences, the UK Royal Society, and more recently in the UN, is one of the ways that the Earth system actually regulates temperature, which is the reflection of sunlight from clouds and particles in the atmosphere. This is a NASA simulation of that reflection as the atmosphere is moving. And what scientists think is that by increasing that reflection of sunlight by just 1 or 2%, you could offset a doubling of CO2 or several degrees of warming. Why do they think that? Because they've observed it. So this is a picture of a cloud bank off the Pacific West Coast of the United States. The bright streaks that you see in the clouds are actually created by particles in the emissions from ships. And you may have heard in the news recently that the International Maritime Organization has implemented regulation to reduce those particles. They come from the dirty sulfate emissions in ships. But one of those things those particles do is have the effect of making the clouds brighter. And collectively, that cloud brightening effect, together with the reflection of sunlight off particles from pollution, all different kinds of that type of particulate pollution from coal plants, from transportation, from ships, the scientists think that that pollution is creating a cooling effect by increasing the reflection of sunlight from the atmosphere. And that cooling effect today, they estimate between 0.3 and 1.1 degrees Celsius. So that's a big range, and it's partly offsetting warming that we would otherwise be experiencing. And one of the things we're getting kind of good at as a society is reducing those particulates and pollution. So we may lose this effect faster than we bring down greenhouse gases. But it's that effect combined with something else that scientists observe that have led them to think about whether you might want to produce that sort of effect actively. And the other thing observed is the effect when very large volcanoes go off. And forgive me because my animation isn't here. So I will talk you through it. But when Mount Pinatubo erupted in 1991, it was a big volcano that emitted a lot of particles at a very high force, pushed them into the highest layer of the atmosphere, the stratosphere, where they stayed and circulated for between a year or two. And they observably cooled the climate system by about 0.5 degree until the particles fell down to Earth. And one of the things that happened that they observed after that was a recovery in Arctic ice in the year after the volcano erupted. So scientists have become fairly confident that if you put particles in the outer layer of the atmosphere, in the stratosphere, that you can cool the planet. There's a lot they don't know about what would happen if you try to do that over a longer period of time. But one of the prominent approaches to cooling the planet, including the recovery of the Arctic, is reflecting sunlight by putting particles in that outer layer of the atmosphere by aircraft and seeing whether or not you could maintain that over the course of a decade or two until you've brought down emissions and implemented the other parts of the paradigm shift to bring the climate system back to health. Likewise, with the streaks that I showed you from the ships in the cloud layer, scientists have proposed the possibility of taking a cleaner, more controlled version of that kind of emission from sea salt particles in seawater to brighten clouds over the ocean. And that by brightening certain areas of susceptible clouds, you might be able to produce a global cooling effect. So the question becomes, and the question that was referred to before in research, is could reflecting sunlight from the atmosphere improve safety over the trajectory that we're on? And can we learn what we need to know about that fast enough to make good decisions? And one of the things we need to be able to do, or try to be able to do, is to allow people in different parts of the world to do projections of what the climate system will look like under probable scenarios for warming, and what the climate system would look like under the best possible scenarios for these interventions, with respect to the impacts in their parts of the world and the things that they care about and the things that affect our health and safety and well-being and environmental systems. So that's a pretty tall order in a pretty short period of time, but you're gonna hear about some of the research involved in doing that. And if we can do the research aggressively, one of the things that we do to support good decisions is to then have our scientific bodies bring together that information in assessments and put it together in terms of a risk analysis, in terms of the benefits, in terms of what the realities are of what the science and evidence are telling us. And what's happened this year is we've had 3 different governmental bodies recommend that kind of assessment. One of them actually did part of that assessment, the Montreal Protocol that looks after the ozone layer, protects the atmosphere. They did the first robust assessment of climate intervention in the stratosphere in their chapter 6. I recommend you take a look. And we had 2 really important reports, one from the UN Environment Program and one from the United States Science Agencies, that recommended research and scientific assessment in these areas as a matter of importance. So we think that there's a possibility that we might be able to do the research and conduct scientific assessment and find ways to make good decisions together. And one of the reasons we think that is because we have some examples of our ability to address really powerfully important critical matters of the environment successfully. And the most successful example is the Montreal Protocol that governs the ozone layer. And in the 1980s, when they determined that there was a threat to humanity from the depletion of ozone in the outer layer of the stratosphere, the world came together. They did a lot of quick science and technical work, and they formed a treaty, which today is the only environmental treaty, binding environmental treaty, that has universal participation from all the countries in the world. But it's operating effectively, it's meeting every year, and not only does it protect the ozone layer, but the Montreal Protocol has actually been the most successful in the chemicals that it targets at actually reducing those greenhouse gases and other substances that influence climate change. So not only is it the most successful in terms of protecting the ozone layer, but it's the single most successful human action on climate change. So what we think is that their example of using research, scientific assessment, and broad, equitable participation from all nations of the world is a possibility for decision-making here. But it starts with the science. And so I'm lucky to be on this panel with some of the young, really superstar scientists in the field. And I look forward to you hearing from them.
Thank you, Kelly. That was a fantastic talk. I'm now really excited to present Haruki Hirasawa. Haruki is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Victoria in British Columbia, where he studies the large-scale climate impacts of marine cloud brightening on global climate using climate models and machine learning tools. He's interested in understanding the large-scale atmosphere and ocean response to human emissions of aerosols, both incidental and deliberate. So thank you, Haruki.
Okay, yeah, so thank you. So my talk is going to be about some of the state of the science in terms of what marine cloud brightening could do, in terms of whether or not it could cool the Arctic, and what might the what we would expect to happen if we would apply it within the Arctic itself. And so Kelly nicely introduced the topic, and I want to go into a little bit more detail about what marine cloud brightening is and why we think it might work, and so that ends up being us. So yeah, I'll have to give a bit of a physics lecture, sorry. Okay, so marine cloud brightening is one of the proposed solar radiation management solar geoengineering techniques, and in particular, the idea for MCB is that we would cool the surface climate by spraying sea salt into clouds over oceans. And so this is a cartoon of of what that might look like in terms of the actual deployment platforms. And so this idea, as Kelly pointed out, is it comes out of observations of a current phenomenon that exists, which is ship tracks. And so ships, as they pass through certain parts of the ocean, often leave these tracks, these streaks of bright clouds behind them. And this is due to pollution from these ships, particularly because they're burning a lot of dirty, sulfur-heavy bunker fuel. And so this is, I believe it's in the same region. It's off of the coast of Alaska, some ship tracks in this particular cloud deck from an image from a NASA satellite. Okay, so this cloud brightening effect happens because aerosols are an important part of of clouds. And so, even in a clean environment, in the natural environment, you have a lot of aerosol particles that already exist in the air, whether it's because of dust or because of natural emissions from bacteria, for example. And these aerosol particles sort of form the core of cloud droplets. So as they disperse into the atmosphere, water vapor starts to attach to these aerosol particles, and over time they grow until they become visible as cloud droplets. And so, of course, these cloud droplets, they interact with sunlight as it comes through and scatter this sunlight. And so this is, of course, why clouds are white. And so what happens under polluted conditions is that you have more aerosol particles, and so there's more places where the water vapor can condense onto. And so as you get these cloud droplets forming, if you keep the amount of water vapor the same, that means you have less water vapor per droplet, and so you get more but smaller cloud droplets. And so this has the effect of increasing the amount of sunlight that's reflected by these clouds, because as you get these smaller particles, the interaction with the sunlight changes. And so making the cloud droplets smaller also has other effects in terms of changing the rate of precipitation, as well as changing some of the how air is interacting with the clouds, and so that can either amplify or diminish this cloud brightening effect. Right, so in the current climate, we're already getting quite a bit of incidental MCB. So shipping emissions are causing quite a bit of these ship tracks, which reflect a lot of sunlight into away from the atmosphere already, and it's believed to have a significant cooling effect on the climate. And this is, but of course, over the years, we've seen a lot of successful regulations to remove these aerosol pollutants from the atmosphere. And this is because sulfur emissions are harmful to both environments in terms of creating acid rain, as well as to air quality as they form particulate matter that are, of course, harmful to human health. And so the idea for a deliberate MCB proposal as a climate intervention would be to, instead of doing this MCB unintentionally with sulfur, these harmful sulfur particles, to instead replace these particles with sea salt, which is thought to be more benign. Okay, so what do we know about what MCB would do to the Arctic? So really the main tool that we have to study this is, of course, still climate models. And it's important to qualify any climate model result by saying that these are uncertain. These are still, climate models are quite complex, but they're still approximations to the real world. And so in particular, in the case of MCB, there's a lot of cloud and aerosol processes that are occurring at scales that are much smaller than what a climate model can capture. And so there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of what might happen as you inject sea salt into these climate models. But what we do know from these climate models is that when we deploy MCB into the climate and we get some cooling, that does, inevitably have an impact on the Arctic, and that's because the Arctic is, as a part of the climate, it's connected to all other parts of the climate, and so even when we're applying MCB in the tropics, which is where we think it would be most effective, that cooling is still being transported by the atmosphere and ocean up to the high latitudes in the poles, and does, according to our climate models at least, indeed restore sea ice. But when we're thinking about what we could do locally within the Arctic, this picture sort of changes in the sense that the type of mechanisms that we would expect to see are slightly different. But there is some reason to believe that Arctic MCB could work, and this is because of a phenomenon known as Arctic haze. And so, since the mid-20th century, we've seen in observations that every springtime, pollution from Europe and North America is transported into the Arctic and forms a blanket of smog that's called Arctic haze. And observations of this Arctic haze have found that during the summer, it does indeed brighten clouds, and it does have some modest cooling effect. But the other thing that these observations find is that during the winter, during the spring, when there's less sunlight, actually this Arctic haze is actually thickening the clouds and increasing the amount of heat that they trap. And so because of the unique situation of the clouds in the Arctic, this means that there's a lot more unknowns in terms of what MCB might do to the Arctic clouds. Okay, but in terms of what the climate models tell us, there's not a whole lot of research on this, but what research we do have does indicate that if we were to emit sea salt into the Arctic, it would brighten clouds in the Arctic, and that would ultimately cool the Arctic and therefore restore sea ice. So this is, for example, a result from one particular climate model where we've injected sea salt into oceanic regions north of 60 North, where there's no sea ice cover. And so this blue region in the bottom panel is showing the amount of sea ice that is being restored due to this MCB intervention. But it's important to note that even though we're putting this sea salt into the Arctic in particular, again, just as the low tropics influence the Arctic, so too does the Arctic influence the rest of the world. And so when we're applying this kind of local MCB, I think it's really important that we make sure we understand what the impacts of these Arctic MCB interventions are on the rest of the world. Okay, so just to conclude, so in terms of the main question that I was asked to answer is, could MCB refreeze the Arctic? And the answer so far seems to be yes, but this is just according to our climate models, and there's a lot of that the climate models can't tell us. And so, of course, this is a place where we need a lot more research. In particular, in the Arctic, there's a real sparsity of observations because it's so cold. It's quite difficult to take observations, particularly in the winter. And so I will leave it. Yeah. So just to say that, I'm not trying to say anything too confidently.
Thank you.
Thank you, Haruki. That was really interesting. And finally, I'd like to welcome Alistair Duffy for our final presentation. Alistair is a PhD student based at University College London. He's researching how the Arctic climate would be impacted by solar geoengineering through stratospheric aerosol injection. His research interests also include Arctic atmosphere dynamics, as well as the links between Arctic change and climate change in the mid-latitudes. And before re-entering academia, he was working on decarbonising the building sector in the UK. So welcome, Alistair.
Thank you, Alice. And before I start, I just want to say a huge thank you to Operatio Arctis for putting this event together. I think it's a really unique and brilliantly put together event. It's just fantastic to see so many people here to discuss climate intervention. So I'm going to continue from where Haruki left us to talk about the second major contender for a means of achieving solar geoengineering, and that's stratospheric aerosol injection. Before I do so, I want to raise two facts, one of which you already heard from Kelly, and that's that volcanic eruptions cool the planet. Here you can see a plot of the temperature following the Mount Pinatubo eruption in 1991, and you see something like 0.5 degree C of cooling that occurred after Mount Pinatubo added 15 million tons of sulfur dioxide to the high atmosphere. And that sulfur dioxide produced sulfate aerosols, small particles that reflected away sunlight, perhaps 1% less of the sunlight coming in, and that resulted in a surface cooling that lasted for several years. The second fact, again, we've mentioned this today, our current pollution masks warming. And globally, it masks something like 0.5 degree Celsius of warming, but locally it can be much larger. The pollution is centered on the northern hemisphere, and it has the largest cooling impact on the very high latitudes. So although we're seeing maybe 0.5 degree C of greenhouse gas warming masked by pollution, in the high latitude regions it can be much more. Okay, so bearing those two facts in mind, let's think about SRM, solar radiation modification. This means reflecting away sunlight to reduce climate change. And within SRM, we can consider one proposal, which would be stratospheric aerosol injection, which means releasing aerosol particles or precursors to those particles into the stratosphere. So the stratosphere is the top part of the atmosphere, something like 15 kilometers up or higher. And it's called the stratosphere because it's stratified, which means that it's essentially split into layers and it's very stable. So when we add things to the stratosphere, they tend to stay there for quite a long time, perhaps several years. And that's why this idea has leverage. Particles added to the stratosphere would have a large impact on the planet for relatively low effort. And I think it's really important to stress that last bullet point here. The only reason to talk about these ideas is because they're easier than rapidly reducing our emissions to zero and then producing large-scale negative emissions. If they weren't easier, there would be no point talking about them. So I've put on the right-hand side there a graphic, sometimes called the napkin diagram, because supposedly someone once drew it on a napkin, and it describes essentially plan A, or the best case version of why we might consider geoengineering. So working from the red line kind of downwards, you see BAU here is business as usual, perhaps an old-fashioned business as usual. Now this is quite a high emission scenario. And if we achieve net zero, we manage to get all the global emissions to zero, everyone has a huge net zero party around the end of the century. At that point, we have to live with whatever the temperature is forever, if all that we do is we cut our emissions. So here we've sketched a scenario where maybe you get to net zero in 2100, and perhaps you have to live with 3 degrees Celsius of warming forever. And you have to live with all the effects of that, such as the ice sheets melting, which John told us so eloquently about, forever. Now, perhaps humanity might decide they don't want to do that, and they might then do a load of CDR, carbon dioxide removal, planting trees, perhaps using technology to do direct air capture, pulling carbon dioxide straight out of the air on large scales. And feasibly, maybe, they could do this over centuries. Right? It would take centuries to pull temperature back down towards another, say, 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, humanity might decide they don't want to live at a warmer temperature over that period. So in this scenario, we imagine maybe they use SAI during those several hundred years to never have to deal with those warmer temperatures. In a way, that's kind of the best case vision for why we think this might potentially be a good idea. But of course, there's lots of reasons to doubt that. So when I was invited to give this talk, I was asked if perhaps I would spend a minute or two talking about why I work on this topic. So I think this figure is my attempt at explaining that. What you can see here is essentially a graphic which is taken from the introduction to a really excellent book on the topic by Oliver Morton called The Planet We Made. And he asks the reader to ask themselves two questions. How bad is climate change? And then the second question, how hard is it to cut emissions? Now, if you are someone that believes climate change is not very bad, the impacts are small, then of course you're not going to want to do climate intervention because it has a large set of risks associated with it. And if you're someone that thinks that getting to net zero is very easy and we could do it tomorrow, then of course you wouldn't consider climate intervention because we would just get to net zero tomorrow. But if, like me, you're someone that is very convinced that climate change is hugely harmful, but has a hunch that getting to net zero is also quite difficult and won't happen rapidly, then I would say to you that you have to consider the potential that climate intervention might make sense. And that's not to say you should be in favor of it today, but I would argue that we have to take it seriously. Cool, I've put a list there of a few reasons why you might be opposed to SOM. I think it's really important to note that talks like the one I'm giving are based on climate modeling. That's what the science of this is mostly based on. And climate modeling is quite good at producing maps of certain variables, but it's not very good at understanding whether conflict might arise because of an action that we take, or unforeseen risks that we haven't even thought of, or whether this will act as a distraction from emission cuts and we won't achieve emissions cuts targets. So this talk will, at times, address that first bullet point as a reason to be against this, but it won't address lots of other potential reasons that you might be opposed to climate intervention. Okay, so that's why you might be opposed to climate intervention. Why might you be in favor of it? Well, if you ask a climate model what happens under SAI, the first thing you'll notice, the thing that really stands out, is that the world gets colder, and lots of the changes that we're seeing under climate change are less. So here I've plotted one scenario for SAI. SAI is in red on the bottom axis, and the medium emission scenario, SSP 245, is climate science speak for a little bit like what we're doing today without much more action, is in blue. And you see on the right-hand side that towards the end of the century, after some amount of time of doing SAI, we have much more sea ice. And sea ice here is acting as an example for many climate variables, and the picture is often largely the same, that we see at least some restoration of those aspects of the climate system when we cool back towards the pre-industrial. Okay, so that's the first thing that you notice if you ask a climate model what happens. The second thing you notice is that SAI would not be a perfect offset of warming. Fundamentally, the climate system can tell the difference between reflecting sunlight and trapping more outgoing radiation with greenhouse gases. Those two things are not the same in the physics. And one example of that, which I think is quite a stark example, is with respect to rainfall or precipitation. So we know that with warming, with greenhouse gases, we intensify the hydrological cycle, and we expect the world to get wetter. And that's what you can see with this red circle here. As we go towards 4 times CO2, so in a world with lots more CO2, we have more warming, but we also have more precipitation. If we were to offset that warming by having less sunlight, you would move towards this blue circle. And you see a world that doesn't have the temperature change because the sun has been turned down in this scenario to offset the warming. But you can notice that the climate here notices the difference, and it's got less precipitation. Now, the reason for that is because essentially all your cooling is happening at the surface, where less sunlight hits the surface, whereas the warming is happening throughout the atmospheric column, where the greenhouse gases trap warming, and they act differently on the climate system. Now, this isn't to say that any scenario of climate intervention would see drastic reductions in precipitation. This is quite an extreme scenario that I've used to illustrate the point. But I think one key message to take home is that SOM in general would not get us back to the past. It would get us to some novel climate state that might have reduced harms associated with it relative to more warming, but it wouldn't be the past. And then I've also pointed out here that there is an option, even in this scenario, of this purple circle. And perhaps a sensible strategy in this case would be to go back to zero precipitation change, but not offset all the warming. And then continuing on that theme of imperfect offsets, another important point to make is that regionally, there would also be changes. We don't live in the global mean temperature, we live in a place, and there would not be exact restoration of the global climate regionally. In this case, again, I've taken a very simplified scenario where we've added CO2 and turned down the sun, and you see this kind of characteristic pattern in which there is residual warming in the polar regions, i.e. they're not cooled back to normal, while the tropics are cooled below normal in this case. Now, again, this is something that might well be avoided with more sophisticated methods of geoengineering. I'm thinking in particular, if you were to take aerosols and inject them more away from the equator and more towards the poles, you might avoid this result. But the key point that there would be regional changes, and we need to understand those, remains. And then lastly in my list of reasons this would be an imperfect offset of warming is seasonality. So we understand that SOM would have impacts on the seasonality of change, particularly in the polar regions. And one contribution to this is the simple fact that there isn't sunlight in the polar regions during winter to reflect, or very little sunlight. So if your method of cooling the planet is to reflect sunlight, then it will be less effective in the Arctic in the winter. And you can see that in these two plots, in which the blue line is our geoengineered world, and it's very good in the summer months, so August, September here, but we have somewhat less restoration of sea ice in the winter months. And there might be consequences to do with that dampening of the seasonal cycle that we could care about for ecological impacts, for example. Okay, so far I've kind of talked about SAI as being one thing, but the reality is it's not one thing. There will be options, and the design of SAI would be a crucial aspect of its impacts. And in particular, you can't design east to west with SAI because the stratosphere has very strong winds that go east to west. So any particle you inject would very rapidly spread around the planet longitudinally. But there would be some ability to control the north to south pattern of cooling. In particular, the more that you injected aerosols towards the polar regions, the stronger your cooling would be towards the polar regions and the less it would be strong towards the equator. And this is just one model simulation showing that with injection at 60 degrees north, we're seeing quite strong cooling throughout the whole of the northern hemisphere, but particularly in the Arctic, and very little cooling in the southern hemisphere. So not much gets across the equator. But an important point to note there is that whilst you might mostly keep your cooling into one region of the planet, the impacts would spread around the globe. So here, I've shown a map of precipitation changes. This is Africa here, that's West Africa, that's the Arabian Peninsula, India. And what you're seeing is a really drastic reduction in the summer monsoon in this simulation for West Africa and India. Now, this is not a stress, an inevitable effect of climate intervention. This is, I think, John Wall referred to this kind of scenario as essentially a mad scenario. I can't remember the word he used, but this is a world where they've deliberately cooled down one hemisphere and not the other, and it creates essentially chaos in the dynamics of the circulation, resulting in these drastic drying of the low latitude in the northern hemisphere regions. But the important point to stress is that you can't expect to interfere with the climate system in one place and not have impacts everywhere. So here we're seeing localized cooling in the Arctic would have large implications for rainfall near the tropics. And then one last bit of science before I stop. I also want to stress that the climate system has processes which will essentially fight back if we try to do very localized interventions. So here I'm thinking about, in a case where we could only reflect sunlight over the Arctic, would we be able to achieve lots of cooling in the Arctic? Well, yes, potentially, but there are reasons why it might be quite difficult to do that. And one of them is to do with the heat transports in the atmosphere and the oceans. So on the left here, you see the globe. This is the equator, this is the pole, this is the Antarctic. And near the equator, we have more sunlight coming in than infrared radiation going out. And the energy has to go somewhere, and where it goes is it's transported by the atmosphere and the oceans towards the polar regions. So although the Arctic is cold, it's not as cold as it would be if we didn't have an atmosphere and an ocean transporting heat towards it. And then in the Arctic, the opposite happens. And because we've got heat coming in, more radiation is emitted to space than is received from the sun. Now, the reason for that heat flux is because this part is colder than this part, and heat travels towards the cold from the warm place. If we then were to run scenarios of cooling the Arctic, and only the Arctic, by turning the sun down northward of 60 or 70 degree north in our climate model, what we find is, unsurprisingly, if you cool a lot locally, the planet will transfer more heat to that cold spot. And so your local cooling is undermined by these compensating heat fluxes. So the key point here is that although it might be possible, potentially, to do solar reflection very locally and have an impact, you have to have very strong local reflections to achieve cooling, because the Earth will kind of fight back and transfer more heat to that cold spot. Okay, I'm going to leave it there and give you these 3 take-home messages. So firstly, SAI would almost certainly cool the planet, including the Arctic. But, as Haruki stressed, we need to know more. There are lots of known unknowns, and presumably many unknown unknowns too. And then lastly, SAI with injection at higher latitudes would likely more effectively restore the Arctic climate on a kind of per amount of sulfate injected basis. But we would still have to think of that as global geoengineering. There aren't really any plausible ways in which you could cool the Arctic, and only the Arctic, by reflecting the sunlight and have no impacts everywhere else. Cool, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Alistair. That was a fantastic presentation. So I think now we're going to have just a few questions based on those, because that was fascinating and I definitely want to hear some more. So I think, Kelly, we'll start with you, if that's okay. In your talk, you mentioned sort of the governance around solar radiation management or modification and climate intervention. How could civil society better support that research and governance also for climate interventions?
Well, thank you for the question, Alex. We had that question come up in the workshop previously, so I had some prompting as well for that. But I think that civil society being, the nonprofit organizations and activists and people, and I think that Operatio Arctis has given us a tremendous example here of how to articulate where we are currently in real terms. And so I think civil society, in terms of being advocates for young people, for the harm that is now happening and that is very proximate, and that we have to, in some ways, Annie put it so well, we have to do away with some of what we hoped was going to be the paradigm for this and look at a new paradigm quickly. So I think that civil society groups, and especially those youth-led organizations where, again, Annie put it well, you're stepping in to the situation. You're 22 years old, you're 24 years old, and you're walking into this reality. And so there's certainly a way in which that, helping the older generation, clarify what's needed, and then, and then advocating for science and information, that, this is a very serious safety situation. We need a lot of scientific evidence fast. And so going to policymakers, going to the media with these messages, I think is really, really helpful.
Yeah, that's great, thank you. I guess touching on that also, it seems like one of the best things we could do to sort of better assess these risks of research. How do we go about trying to involve more people in that research? I guess any of you guys want to answer that question.
Well, I'll just say a quick word, since I know we have some policymakers here and some folks who want to help, but definitely funding is a question. And so for both philanthropy and for government sources of funding, like moving funding into specifically research on interventions, but also some of the basic science and these uncertainties that they referred to and how aerosols and these factors work in the climate system is absolutely crucial. So we have to move some money to support the research for scientists like these.
Okay, well, I guess one thing I would say is that, I think most people who work on climate modeling, in particular for SRM, tend to be trained as either meteorologists, perhaps, or as physicists, and that means that the climate models tend to be good at things like temperature and precipitation, and these are obviously very important, but they're not the whole picture in terms of the climate impacts. And so I guess what I would say is that I think it's really important that, I guess, tell us what is important for you and what we should be looking for. And, there's a lot of things that we could put in our models that, maybe we just decide is not important or not worth putting effort into, but maybe we should be. And yeah, I think that would be very helpful to know what we should be looking for.
I guess one thing I would add is, it's been said a couple of times in the workshop in the last few days that perhaps in the generation before us in science, there was a feeling that working on this was just a death knell for your career. This was a bad thing to work on, and you wouldn't get jobs, you wouldn't get funding, and that I think is changing, but it needs to change more rapidly. And there's a huge untapped potential of expertise of climate science that is not working on this problem, which it could be used, and we have to find ways to kind of break the taboo around this in the scientific community to bring those experts in and widen our community of people working on this, which is still really quite a small field.
Yeah, that's great. I guess also there are probably quite a lot of risks associated with stratospheric aerosol injection or marine cloud brightening that are kind of, the uncertainties in the models are down to sort of research gaps in general climate change itself. What would you say would be the most critical risks with solar climate intervention, either in modeling or ecological or social aspects?
I guess I can, in my own opinion, and this is just an opinion, the most important risks with SOM are not the physical climate risks. They are the socio-political risks, the risk of conflict, the risk of militarization, the risk of accidentally starting a war. That's what I really worry about. But of course, there are physical climate risks too. But that's just my opinion.
Okay, I guess, yeah, again, sort of reiterating the point that, of course, we know a little bit about the physical climate risks, but, we are adding things to the atmosphere, whether it's MCB or SAI, and these will also have knock-on effects on the chemistry as well as biology. And so I think, yeah, so the risks, I think, are in those unknown unknowns, in those kinds of sectors where we simply don't know what the risks could be, I suppose.
And kind of echoing that and looking at some of these mechanisms for decision-making that call on science, and then looking at the work from Alistair, Haruki, yourself, Alice, like these early modeling studies that show such differences in different kinds of impacts depending on how you might do this, what regions of clouds you brighten, what latitudes, and you get some really interesting side effect differences. So we think about it like medicine. And right now we have these treatment options, and we know little something about their efficacy and really not enough about their side effects. And so I think the physical risk profiles, they're linked up to your concerns, Alistair, which is, are people afraid, that they're going to be on the downside of these side effects to somebody else's benefit? Or can we all see this together? And if we can all see it together, then maybe some of the risks you're talking about get muted.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess kind of I mean, for me personally, the last couple of days, the main takeaway has been we kind of need some more research in this area. But obviously, that will only come with time, and hopefully we can solve some of these problems. I guess when we sort of talk about solar climate intervention, one of the risks that I've seen in the past when talking with colleagues is I think Alistair, you touched on it, the idea that we may not, or people may not then think we need to do anything else. Like it's seen as an alternative, it's an easy option. How do you guys all feel about how the role of solar climate intervention sits within that bigger climate issue and how we tackle these sort of bigger problems?
I can start, since I've talked to people about this, and some of those interactions haven't been like you might anticipate. So I think one of the things about research and dialogues like this in climate intervention, you know, they're really calling to the forefront how acute the risk is, and just where the situation is at. And if listening to Anni's talk, like I think the dialogue's kind of moving on from is it mitigation or intervention? It's, well, mitigation is absolutely necessary because, you know, using the cancer analogy, if we're going to do climate intervention, and one of the things that their work shows is that actually less is more. Like the less you do, the lower the side effect risk is. So, so I think there's some ways in which this kind of research can really help highlight what exactly is happening in a way that propels people, hopefully. And also, that again, to a point that Anni made beautifully, which is that these escalating impacts are not going to help us in our mitigation efforts. People are suffering, they're desperate. These are really expensive things to happen and really tragic. So it may be that, you know, in keeping the system more stable, that we actually promote some of the mitigation efforts that we're trying to do as well.
So sort of using it to fuel motivation to mitigate more rather than trying to push the can down
to
the
fuel
road.
motivation and reduce desperation.
Yeah.
And leave some resources free for us to do the transition that we need to do and the science that we need to do.
Do you guys have anything to add on that?
No, I think I would echo what Kelly said, really. I think we have to take seriously the worry that there is a very bad scenario where you have a bigger and bigger layer of aerosols because the world is not cutting emissions, and you end up living under this Damocles sword of warming hanging over you forever because you've not got to net zero. And that is something we have to take seriously. But yeah, maybe we have to be optimistic that the world could manage to do both. And you know, we did say very similar things about adaptation back in the 1990s, that we shouldn't adapt, or we can't talk about adapting to climate change because then we won't cut emissions. And that sounds kind of silly to us now. We clearly have to cut emissions whilst adapting to climate change. And perhaps, you know, we've been making the same mistake again to give up on solar climate intervention because of that risk.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add.
Yeah.
Well said, Kelly.
Brilliant. Well, I'll just wrap up then. This was a fantastic discussion. Thank you all for sharing your perspectives and contributing to this event. And thank you for having us.
Wow, thank you so much. And thank you, our audience, for joining us for this first part of this event. Because next up, we are going to have a break. And after the break, we actually only have one or two final things before we continue to the after part of this wonderful evening. We will continue after the break at 7:30 p.m. And you can find all sorts of interesting things to do in the main hall. There is an installation, there is a conversation wall where you can actually yourself take part in this discussion. And please read through our tomorrow stories, which bring different climate scenarios to life with the power of fiction. So yes, please enjoy your break, and let's see each other 7:30. Thank you.
It's supposed to be muted. Hello? Hello, no, it's some bloody monkeys trying to sell me some shit. Arctic Centre is a unique institution. Such a wide range of research, from law to glaciology and language, and with excellent links to the indigenous Arctic peoples. Our science centre is visited by 100,000 people a year, and we're really well known globally, often the first point of call for international journalists and experts, but much less well known inside Finland, because we're out there on the Arctic Circle in Rovaniemi.
Täällä ollaan. Mä sanoin, että täällä ollaan. Ei se maailma vielä loppunut. Ei se maailma vielä loppunut. Mut ei oo niin helppoa. Tää, joka uskoo tulevaan.
Tarvitaan semmoista tutkimusta, joka niinku lähtee täältä.
The Arctic Centre is quite unique as a place for Arctic research because we host so many different disciplines.
Mä uskon tulevaan. Mä uskon siihen todella.
Good evening, everyone, and so awesome to see so many of you here. And I'm so happy to be here also. I'm just briefly talking about the film, very briefly, but yeah, I'm Vilma Rimpelä, and I'm from Rare Media, and I'm one of the directors of this film, Dear Arctic. And this film is produced by Finnish Youth Media Rare, our team, and journalist Johannes Roviomaa. And we all come outside from film industry. We are all journalists, and this is our first feature film ever. So that's why I'm also nervous. Thank you. Dear Arctic is a documentary film about Arctic research in the Arctic Centre in the University of Lapland. We follow 6 researchers from 3 research topics. We have Arctic anthropology with Florian and Aitalina. We have climate repair with Ilona and John, who are also here. And we have a little bit of critical Arctic research with Heidi and Marja. And I'm very excited to share with you that we will have a preview of this film tonight as a part of Arctic Momentum. And this after event will be right after this at Orion, so a couple of blocks away from here. It will start at 9 with drinks and music and something to eat also. And then at 10, the film will start. So you are all very welcome there if you like. But yeah, have a nice night and hope to see you there.
Thank you, Vilma. And let's now move on to the final part of our evening, which is our main panel here. And after that, some very, very nice music that you also heard in the documentary trailer in the hall. So, what we're going to look at next is what actions must be taken on climate intervention research and policy to prevent climate risks. Please welcome to the stage to tell us more about this panel from Operaatio Arktis, Ellen Haaslahti. Take it away.
Thank you, everyone. My name is Ellen Haaslahti, and I work as the network coordinator for Operaatio Arktis to ensure that nobody is left behind when we go through these important discussions and plan the way for a safer future. And I'd like to invite our panelists for this final panel. And first, I would like to invite Pirita Näkkäläjärvi. Pirita is a Sami with a unique profile combining indigenous rights advocacy and global business. Pirita is an elected member of the Sami parliament in Finland and a member of the Inari Municipal Council. She has also had a long career as an advisor for mergers and acquisitions for Finnish and European companies. Pirita is working on her doctoral researcher at Sibelius Academy, researching Saami-oik and cultural appropriation. Pirita is from a reindeer herding and entrepreneurial family in Inari, Sápmi, and her mother tongue is Northern Sami. Welcome.
Thank you.
And as our second panel, I'd like to invite here Tapio Reinikainen. Tapio is a negotiator in the Montreal Protocol that was mentioned earlier, world's most successful multilateral environmental agreement, which protects the ozone layer and mitigates global warming. He also chairs a constituency in the Multilateral Fund to implement the Montreal Protocol. Tapio is also a member of the International Ozone Commission and Ozone Research Managers of the Vienna Convention. Welcome, Tapio.
Thank you.
And last but not least, I'd like to welcome here Johanna Kentala-Lehtonen. Who is the Secretary General of the Finnish Expert Panel for Sustainable Development, which is an independent science panel working at the auspices of the Prime Minister's Office. Previously, she has been responsible for the Finnish EU policy coordination on the Green Deal at the EU Affairs Department of the Prime Minister's Office, and also worked at the Climate Department of the Ministry of the Environment. She is a Doctor of Social Science with a doctoral thesis on international climate politics, and she is also a governing board member of the Nestling Foundation. Welcome all. So we've had a lot of new information today, a lot of difficult topics. And I guess it is up to us to make some sense out of this and think about also a kind of local approach as we are all living around here. So I would like to begin with a question that you can all answer to. So according to the expert panel convened by the UNEP, and we already have seen the report there, the conversation process on these solar climate interventions needs to involve discussion on a broad range of issues with all stakeholders. And I was thinking that in order to make this happen in the Arctic and Finland, what is needed in your opinion? What should be done and by who, maybe? Pirita, would you like to begin?
Yeah, thank you. The topic that we're discussing today, climate repair and climate interventions, is a hugely challenging topic. And you might know that many indigenous peoples globally and also some Sami organizations are very critical of certain climate intervention measures and initiatives. We at the Sami Parliament in Finland don't have an official opinion. We never had to make an official opinion on these topics, but I think in the future, we will have to. I understand where the reservations come from. We have had a long history with scientists, and there's an old Sami joke coming from the times when we were nomadic people and living in the Sami lavvu, in the Sami teepees, that the Sami family consists of mom, dad, a number of children, and an anthropologist in the corner of the lavvu. And unfortunately, you know, we've had a history that we have, and sorry to be so blunt, scientists like yourselves coming to our land, sucking our traditional knowledge, making a career out of it, and we never hear back. So I understand the reservations. And then another point I want to make, and I hope you remember this one. On the other hand, we are winter people. We are an Arctic indigenous people. Our livelihoods, our life is adapted to the cold climate. Our animals like the reindeer, salmon, and so on, they are adapted to the cold. So we really would like to keep our winters. So it's my personal opinion that we need to keep all the options open. And it's great to be part of the discussion. So thank you for inviting us.
Thank you, Pirita. I understand that you also mean that we should be including more indigenous voices, and I'm so happy that you're here, for example, in doing so. So, Tapio, would you like to comment on the question I was asking about how should we make this discussion to include all the stakeholders in Finland? What do you think?
There are so many aspects that it's like hard to decide from where to start, but I'd like to first thanks all the organizers, the wonderful event that you have been organizing on very topical issue, and there are many concepts that might be not so common for participants, but we all learn together. But I would like to add one more very useful concept to this discussion by asking you, do any of you know what is DNHS? DNHS. You know. Anyone? I can't see. Please go ahead and answer. I can't see. That's right. That's right. Good.
I think it was Atte Harjanne, one of our members of the parliament.
Tämä on hyödyllinen EU-konsepti ja se on tässä yhteydessä aika käyttökelpoinen, koska niin kuin tässä pyritään tekemään joku interventio olisi tärkeää myös katsoa, että siitä ei olisi muille ympäristökysymyksille niin kuin haittaa, merkittävää haittaa, eli do not significant harm while mitigating the climate change or global warming. Tämä on yksi niin kuin tärkeä lähtökulma meiltä tähän näin, ja itse kun tulen niin kuin Montrealin pöytäkirjan, joka on yläilmakehän otsonikerroksen suojelusopimus, niin tämä koskettaa niin kuin meitä, ja ei ole sillä lailla niin kuin kovin lokaalinen että, kysymys, vaan on niin kuin erinomaisen globaali. Jos ajatellaan, niin kuin, että minkälaista harmia jostakin näistä interventioista voi tulla, niin ennen kaikkea tulee mieleen tämä Stratospheric aerosol injection, eli rikkidioksidin tai muun aineen ruiskuttaminen yläilmakehään tai stratosfääriin. Ja tämä on niin kuin mun mielestä kriittinen ero näiden monien interventioiden välillä, että kun puututaan tuonne stratosfääriin, niin se on niin kuin aika harva paikka. Siellä on vähän ainetta ja yksi aine on valtavan tärkeä, otsoni, joka suojelee meitä.
Tapio, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I think some of our guests don't understand Finnish, so we might have to.
I'm so sorry.
It's okay. I was actually going to maybe bring this up that we have during the past days been discussing a lot about the accessibility in this discussion.
Absolutely.
But so that it would make sense also to, as a service to the audience, where I can imagine that many of you might speak Finnish, so it might be more accessible. But I think
I'll keep
stick in English. But
yes,
when we move on to the audience questions, then please go ahead and use whichever language of those two that we understand.
Sorry, Ellen, and those friends who are not Finnish speakers. This is, of course, English-speaking seminar. And so I was starting about the do no significant harm principle, which is very useful concept in here, while it means that while we are doing interventions to mitigate something, we shouldn't do any harm, significant harm to another issue or a problem. So stratospheric aerosol injection is something that we have somewhat critical attitude, but I come to this later on, and we can move forward. Thank you.
Yes, Johanna, you can also comment on the question about what kind of discussion we should be having in Finland regarding these issues. But maybe I could add already to that one question for you, especially also regarding the state of this kind of discussion. What do you think it's like in the international field of sustainability and policy regarding climate interventions? Do you see this kind of discussion there where you work?
Yeah, I have to say that very important issues were already raised here, and good to add another question, but if I start still pondering a little bit what is needed and what kind of discussion. So I think that this event has really lightened up and started maybe a discussion that needs to continue, and I think it's very brave to bring it up and especially to challenge the paradigm, and good to show that we need to start a new discussion, and we need to understand where we stand regarding the climate change, and what is what can we still do about it. On the international sustainability level, I haven't seen much discussion on this yet, but of course there was already reference to what US science body is doing and starting this kind of research. And I have to say that what comes to my mind very as a very good analogy is what happened with the GMO 20 years ago, when there was no international agreement on how to advance with it. And now we have seen that different parts of the globe have moved to different directions, and we have seen harm, but we have also seen good results from some research, and we see that in some parts of the globe we must use these technologies. And at the same time, EU has stand by and watched how the thing is developing elsewhere and denied it here. And I think that this shouldn't happen again, that we should now understand that the research is needed everywhere, and we need to have this discussion already. And I think that it's very important to bring it to the political level as well, because lately the carbon removal has started to gain more momentum, and it's started to be a discussion, and maybe it's time to bring also this issue on the debate.
Yes, good to hear your thoughts already, and I agree with you, Johanna, that maybe we need like a beforehand better understanding as soon as possible. Maybe to take from that, you mentioned governing these kind of techniques. Tapio, I could ask from you, in your perspective, what kind of things should be considered if you wanted to establish a governance framework for solar climate interventions, experiments and deployment?
At the moment, in my understanding, there is not anything in place. There is only UNEA resolution, draft resolution from 2019, and where it's recommended that this kind of assessment, which is now done actually by UNEP and also Montreal Protocol Scientific Assessment Panel, these have like started the discussion now. So basically, first steps are taken. So that's the first thing. I think to get it into the international discussion. Maybe second thing would be banning of private enterprises of doing on their own anything, any kind of intervention. And in general, I think it's not timely to start any kind of interventions in stratosphere at the moment without preparing proper governance framework for that. It may be under UNFCCC or Montreal Protocol or UNEA or as a separate, whatever it is, but it would need to be established just in case these kind of interventions someday need to be done, which would be the last resort. The first resorts are, of course, mitigation, and mitigation. And there are also would need to be done some paradigm change in the mitigation side.
I agree. Thank you for your insights. Perhaps I could also follow up on that. Regarding the mitigation, we heard a very powerful speech from Anni about how it hasn't been really enough and what we might be already losing, although we would continue with the mitigation. I was thinking, would you like to comment on that why we are in this kind of state? So some Earth system damage is already unavoidable, even with sharp emission reductions, and yet climate policy does not aim to prevent this. And do you have any ideas that you would like to share here? That why do you think that we kind of feel that we are forced to accept a great deal of damage already? Does somebody wants to begin? It's a big question.
If you colleagues don't want to start, I could continue on that. It's clear that we are in a very dangerous zone. Already in July, 1.5 centigrade was extended. It was like the warmest July ever in a recorded history, and we are in dangerous stage where the tipping points, as was earlier discussed here also, are very close. That maybe also some of them taking place, and the process is going on, as we heard from previous presentations. Something needs to be done really quickly, and even though I said many times mitigation, there needs to be within the mitigation range new paradigm change, but to little bit comfort people that we have also been able to do something successfully. For example, in the Montreal Protocol, we have avoided already 135 gigatons of very strong climate gases worth of 135 gigatons CO2 equivalent by phasing out chlorinated substances. And so that's about 1 centigrade of avoidance of global warming.
Tapio, go ahead, but could you keep it closer?
So
Thank you.
Maybe also it's dependent how you calculate. You know, if this mitigation effort wouldn't have not been done, the CFC levels would have risen so high that even in the mid-latitudes there would have been an ozone hole, and that would have meant that the carbon sinks would have been largely destroyed in a very large areas, and some scientists have calculated that it's worth of one additional centigrade of warming. So there is a tremendous history in the Montreal Protocol of avoiding global warming, and something further can be done still within that framework, and we are now doing implementing Kigali Amendment, which made Montreal Protocol also a climate treaty, not only ozone treaty, phasing down HFCs, super climate gases, and then we are negotiating currently of additional measures to take energy efficiency efforts related to the phasing down of HFCs. But that's all we can do almost, and the rest has to be done by other parties and that in other fora, mainly Paris Agreement. So, and they need to accelerate their work. Otherwise, we are in a very, very deep trouble.
Yeah, maybe I can continue from there. From our point of view, speaking from the world of indigenous peoples, it has taken too long to integrate our indigenous traditional knowledge into policy making and into science as well. But that's something that can be improved, and I'm so happy to tell you and share with you that here in Finland we have a very unique arrangement that came into effect about a week ago. So as part of the new Climate Act, new legislation, we established a Sami climate panel where we have our scientists, also Finnish scientists, and our traditional knowledge holders sitting together and being part of climate policy and policy making. And it's really the first time in the world that something like this is established. So Finland can be very proud because this means that our traditional knowledge, indigenous traditional knowledge and scientific knowledge are treated as equal sources of information. And that's how it should be, because that's how we can come up with better solutions. I really believe in that.
Yeah, maybe if I can continue a little bit, maybe on the psychological side, what comes to this question, that why do we accept so much damage already? And I think that it has to do a lot of psychological issues, but one might be that if we understood the amount of the destruction we already accept, we would have to accept at the same time that we need to change a lot of in our normal lifestyles, especially in the Western world. So it's the dramatic systemic change that is needed, and people are not good at looking at that they need to change, because we always think it's safer to stay where we are. It's more risky to go somewhere we don't know what it means. And in this, I think what we would need more is utopias of a better future, and what could be better in the future where the climate issue is resolved. And I don't see enough this, and this is also a psychological issue, that people are very good in imagining dystopias, so the worst possible catastrophes. And we are seeing and thinking of these all the time, so we are practically also going to this direction. So we should much more think what is the better we want to have, and try to build on that. And I think that is something we really need in the society a lot more. What should be done differently, and it would make the situation better.
Thank you, Johanna. I couldn't agree more. And it's not too late for that, I hope. And thank you also for sharing all of your insights. And maybe now we have had a lot of discussion going here, so I would like to already open the discussion together with all of you. So we would like to have some audience questions now and keep discussing, and perhaps keep our answers pretty concise, so there's more discussion going on. So please, if anyone has a question, you can always tell it in Finnish or English if you prefer. We have there people bringing you the microphone, so please use that. And if you want to direct your question to somebody, just please do so, or yes.
Hi, my question is for maybe focused on to Tapio. So firstly, I agree with not letting private entities going kind of full rogue with applying geoengineering. But I wanted to ask that when making all of these policies and frameworks, how fast or how slow is the policy making process, at least in your level? And what are the things that can be done faster? Because obviously we're in a big hurry. Yeah.
That's a really good question. My answer basically is that it has been too slow, and the state of alertness has not been sufficient so far. And what basically we should do is to establish governance framework for that rather soon than later. And in case kind of very rapid warming would take place, for example, if methane clatrates or some other situation would rapidly change the concentrations of climate gases in the atmosphere, and the warming would happen very abruptly. So for that case, I think there should be a governance structure. It's totally different thing than like allowing us to sit down and kind of relieve the effort level in mitigation and other measures. So rather soon than later, but anyway, these processes are quite slow, so it's better to start early.
Thank you. And do we have another question? Is the mic already?
I have a mic.
Yes, please.
Okay. I'm Tuulia Reponen from Elokapina, and I have a question, actually two. Sorry.
Sorry, we can't really see you.
Yeah, I have two questions. One question is for all the panelists and for everybody in the audience to think about. And maybe we hear an answer from the panel as well. And the second question is directed at Piritta. So I have heard many times here it is evening the pronoun we. We have believed this old paradigm and we should be dreaming this new paradigm, or we are not courageous enough to dream about positive futures. And I want to ask us, who is the we? Is there one we that is with the old paradigm? And is there one we that is fighting for the new paradigm? Or is there a multitude of communities pulling this rope in different directions? And is there a power struggle that we should address more tonight? And a bit connected to that, I want to ask Piritta to discuss more. What are the concerns that the Sami community has? I'm very deeply interested in hearing that and learn more about them. Thank you.
Okay, well, maybe I'll start with the we question, a very difficult question. But from the indigenous point of view, indigenous peoples need to be in the decision-making processes, in the governance models, everything. We need to be included. And it's not because, you know, it would be nice to offer our traditional knowledge and so on. That's, of course, important. But the reason, for example, here in the Arctic, in Sápmi, which is our area divided into the Finnish, Swedish, Norwegian, and Russian part, the reason that we need to be included is that we have rights. And this is something that is forgotten. This is something that is forgotten, especially here in Helsinki and in the other capitals of our kind of mother countries. We indeed have rights. Indigenous rights are really, really powerful. They're really strong. And we have a lot of rights to our lands and waters and the climate and the environment as a whole. So we need to be there, involved. Just like in this event, you can see there's a big group of Sami young people organizing this event. So we own this event and this discussion already, and I'm really proud of that. And then, before I let my colleagues continue, on the criticism, I think there were kind of procedural criticism and then kind of more to do with the impact of the solar management. So if I understand correctly, the project that was going on 2 years ago on the Swedish side of Sápmi was something that was brought from the US without the knowledge of the Sami people there, but also without the knowledge of the Swedish government. So I can imagine that there was a lot of criticism. So again, we need to give consent, free, prior, and informed consent to projects that impact our way of life. So this is an example, and I think that's why the big pushback. And then there were concerns about, so what happens if the solar geoengineering stops? Is there going to be a huge increase in temperatures? You know, all the unknowns and unknowns that were discussed here, I think were part of the concern. And then one concern that I've seen, especially from our Indigenous brothers and sisters from the US, is that what will happen with actions like this to the bond between environment, nature, and the human? And are we breaking and disturbing something that is sacred and shouldn't be done? So understandable, but my personal opinion is that we need to keep on researching and we need to keep on trying to understand. And I was really admiring your time scales on the graph. So your time scales were going to 2,300. I do some modeling in my financial modeling in my work. They usually go to, if I'm lucky, to 2030. So wow, the work that you are doing, it's amazing. And I think we should continue to do this work, but bearing in mind the risks.
I go back to the power struggle question, which I think is very topical. And of course, one reason that I think this debate, having it largely in the society, won't happen very soon, it should happen sooner than later, is definitely that there are interests which are conflicting. We have already seen it in many perspectives, and of course there are also in this debate and in this regard, and I think it came also in the earlier speeches very well that there are a lot of known unknowns and unknown unknowns, which I like as a concepts very much, that we don't know the effects, but we know that they are different for different regions, and we have to know more before there can be decisions. So research is the first thing that we need to have more.
Yeah, who are we? I think it's really important decision. I think that definition. I think that we come from there to ownership, and in environmental issues, I have been in that opinion that the ownership is within each individual as well as groups that we form. And for example, when we are discussing about Arctic momentum and Arctic issues, I think the special rights are within the Sami community, and while we are trying there to protect the snow and the cold and the conditions where their livelihoods are depending on. We also need to understand that also the ozone depletion hits worst to the Arctic regions. We had already 2011 not only Antarctic ozone hole, but we had Arctic ozone hole, and these kind of things are affecting the people who live in the north above the polar circle most. So that's one example, definitely. And for the ownership, I think that it's really important that young people raise their voices and demand from governments and people like us working in the governments that we should do more. And also think sometimes out of the box. And I'm suggesting here now kind of one thing which is like out of the box thinking when we are talking about Paris Agreement. And this is a little bit of news maybe, or new type of thinking that, we are trying to control emissions through national determined contributions, so promises, nationally defined promises that how much we are reducing emissions compared to baseline. That's what is done in the Paris Agreement. In the Montreal Protocol, we are doing, we are agreeing that all countries are reducing production of these substances and consumption of these substances. So if we transfer this kind of thinking to the other climate gases, so main climate gases, CO2, nitrous oxide, methane, it would mean that we would need to step by step set schedules when to stop producing fossil fuels and technology by technology. So not all in one go, because that would cause large social problems. But once the timetable is set, the innovations start to arise. That's exactly what happened in the Montreal Protocol, and that would happen also if that kind of strategy change, or not necessarily change, but to complement the current paradigm and the way to go. And nowadays there are technological alternatives for most of technologies, so this might be a way to go. So give time enough, give some exemptions, technology by technology, and then set limitations to those countries who don't agree on that. So that is something for which I wish to be further discussed. Not necessarily, it can be discussed now, but something for food for thought.
Yes, food for thought, because right now we have very little time. So perhaps just some final words from you. So could you answer with a very concise few words answer that we have here, for example, the tomorrow stories and the scenarios that you mentioned, like utopias. Like what kind of changes are you especially working for? Perhaps in this context that we have, so climate risk especially, like what is your takeaway from this that you will keep continuing, like working for the best case scenarios that we can have at this point of climate change?
Maybe I'll start. From our point of view, we need to be part of all of these discussions, and we're always happy to come in and participate in all sorts of things as equal participants and as equal partners, because that's the best way to go forward together.
I think that this was very useful kind of shaking and alerting event for myself, and thanks for the organizers that you kind of have jumped out of the box and shaking and rattling the box a little bit. So I think that's really quite necessary. Something new will certainly emerge. Not everything that is what has been in the agenda is suitable, but all of them need to be studied, and I think that's a good takeaway from here.
It's very easy to agree with Tapio. I think also that getting a new ideas and also seeing how fruitful and important it is to work together with youth and with indigenous people, with different groups in the society, and really continue the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And thank you for
Thank you. Kiitos.
Thank you so much. Now, just a couple of closing words. Thank you so much to all of you for coming and joining us. Thanks for all of our panelists, our speakers. Thank you to all of the people who have organized this event with us, Silver Lining and Rara Media. And yes, I'm personally very, very grateful that this happened. And this event is called Arctic Momentum, and having conversations with all of you in the lobby during the break and hearing from you, I'm feeling the momentum. I truly am. Yeah, we always say that what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. So I just want to close this event by saying we also hope that what happens in Arctic Momentum does not stay in Arctic Momentum. So please spread the word in all of your social media posts that you may put up, tag us in there. And when you leave, there is going to be sparkling drinks in the lobby, and the great Vest Ice is performing for us. And for those of you who are coming to join us to the after event, see you there. There's a few seats left there. Yes, and when you go to the lobby, you can still read the tomorrow stories and put your messages into the conversation board. Thank you so much for all of the people who put this space together. Siiri Hänninen with our space design, and especially Sana as well, and Ainu for organizing this space. And thank you for Venla Lankinen for writing those amazing tomorrow stories. I find them very inspiring and moving as well, so give a big hand for them. Thank you so much. And on my behalf, thank you so much. And just one last thing, we would like to take a group photo with everyone from Operaatio Arktis on this stage. And no, one final thing. Thank you, Anton, so much. We are selling our brand new publication, Arctic Endgame, in the lobby. Please buy it. You can also become our supporting member or donate to us. There's going to be flyers out there if you want to help us. We would be very, very grateful. So please remember that. But now, everyone from Operaatio Arktis, welcome to the stage. Let's take a picture. Let's make some space. There's a lot of us, as you can see. Who's taking the picture? That's the question. Anyone with the camera?
Ottakaa nyt molemmat. En mä tiedä. Joo.
Everyone needs to be included. That's good. Yeah.
Is het Roberto?
yeah, all of our fellow organizers and everyone. Okay, we're yet to take the first photo. I'm so sorry, it's taken a while. Thanks. You can go to the lobby now as well. You don't have to witness this. There's sparkly rings and Vesta so soon. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.